Administrator's office. Want to introduce Director Motella and her team?
Certainly, you sort of started. Council President, council members, mayor, members of the public, while they are approaching, I would like to introduce Chow Motella, our DEI director, and Jory Johnson, project manager, who works very closely with Chow and the DMC team. And then they also are supported by the principal from the Mackie, I'm going to get it wrong, company, Lynn Pingle and her team, and they will be providing an update of the results of the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Barriers Study, which is about purchasing and procurement and trying to make sure we have an equitable environment with regard to being able to select disadvantaged businesses in a more ready way. With that, since they have their presentation up, I will turn it over.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council President, council members, and community that have joined us. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Really excited to share with you the results of this study, but more so the need for it. We're very appreciative to Destination Medical Center that funded this study. And the point of it was to really understand not only the outcomes that are visual to us in the data that we collect, but really understand the barriers that disadvantaged businesses face in terms of contracting with the city and with projects that are funded by Destination Medical Center. So for this particular study, a broad definition of DBEs, same as targeted businesses, they're owned and operated by women, people of color, BIPOC folks, right? People who are economically disadvantaged, veterans, disabled, and small businesses. So broader picture, trying to understand why this is important. I mean, we've had lots of conversations over time about the broad disparities that we see in our community. And we know one of those is really fueled by economics, right? And how or whether or not folks are able to access the economic engine that's in our community. So as part of this study, we put on an RFP. We're really excited to have Mackie Company be that group, bringing a joint experience of lived and land experiences with small businesses as developers and contractors, and having that really broad perspective was very important to the team. We're also joined by Kevin Bright from Destination Medical Center and Wafa Online. Really great to have them with us. And each of them will introduce themselves as they come forward to share their expertise. Now, for a little bit of history, in 2013, as you all know, Destination Medical Center was formed. 5.6 million investment in our community. We also know that at that time, we were not really collecting any information specific to targeted businesses. So we weren't sure how well they were participating. We're only able to see evidence on the other end of it in terms of outcomes, right? And in 2015, all the way through now, in their wisdom, were very intentional in saying, how do we know whether or not targeted businesses are participating? How do we track them? And more so, how do we become really intentional to make sure that they are participating? So from 2017 to about 2019, we had SRF be the contractor who managed the targeted businesses, the contracts, prevailing wage, all of that on DMC funded projects. It wasn't until about 2020 that City Council also adopted those goals. Really great that we did that. And that means that we were also including city CIP projects in that. And in 2019, a lot of that work was centralized within the city by hiring project manager Jory Johnson to do that work. It was very much on compliance, but also ensuring that we're building capacity, right? Making sure that we move from the 4 DBE certified businesses that we had to the 22 that we have now, which is some growth in that area. So what does this mean? Looking at the screen in front of you, in 2021, we had about 7 projects. All of those were DMC funded projects that had goals that were tied to them. What you adopted was a commitment to decrease that threshold over the years from 5 million in 2021, all projects of that size, all the way with the goal and really great aspiration that by 2025, all projects that are $175,000 and above would have targeted business goals, prevailing wage goals, and workforce participation goals. So with that, it would be really wonderful to have Jory provide a little more context on what that has looked like, both from the DMC funded projects as well as city CIP projects.
Do you have questions up to this point?
I think we're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Again, I'm Jory Johnson, the project manager for targeted business, prevailing wage, and workforce participation. But this study is focused on one of those requirements. Those are the targeted business contracting goals. And it started with DMC funded projects. in 2017. And I'm presenting the results for both DMC-funded projects and the city CIP projects, which will come next. So over the past 6 years, DMC has funded, actually it says 28 million in contracts, but the actual payment has been about 20 million in professional services contracts. Those are architecture, engineering, and design contracts, mostly associated with the Link Rapid Transit. And we have had about 6% in targeted business contracts on all of those contracts. Those contracts go to the certified targeted businesses that we are talking about. In heavy civil construction, and heavy civil are the streets, sewers, and sidewalks in the DMC district, we have had $103 million in contracts with a 4% targeted business goal, and we've been at 6% targeted business contracts on those projects, so that's above goal. In commercial construction, those have primarily been private investment projects in the DMC district, except for one project, that's the Chateau Theater, that was considered commercial construction. So we raised the goal on commercial construction projects from 4 to 7% in 2020, with the resulting cumulative number of 7.8%. But what doesn't stand out is that on a couple of our commercial construction projects, specifically the Mortensen Discovery Square and Phase 2, they have had about 20% targeted business contracts on those private investment projects. At 3.4 million on Discovery Square 1 and then 2.9 million on Discovery Square 2. And what doesn't also stand out in that big lump sum is on the Berkman, there was approximately $10 million in targeted business contracts. Okay, so then on city CIP projects, pretty much just started last year. There were no projects in 2021 that met the $5 million threshold. So this really started last year in 2022. So the projects are just last year and what we bid so far this year in 2023. In the commercial construction, we've struggled a little bit. I'll start with actually the heavy civil construction. We've done well, okay? We are above the goal. The goal is 4%. We're at 5.4%. Commercial construction, there were just a few projects. There was Cascade Lake Park, the downtown business energy transition projects, the Mayo Civic Center and Art Center, and that's at 7%, but the City Hall project is at 4%, hoping to gain more contracts to meet the goal of 7%. And we had one community development private investment project, that is the Northern Heights TIF project, and we have 578,000 on targeted business contracts. They're right at 4%. That was actually prior to the goal of 7%. They were exempted from the 7%, so they're right on target. Okay, so total, we have in just the last 15 months, 2,670,000 in targeted business contracts. Okay, that's more than what we ever had before, at least what we ever tracked before. It's just less than 5%, but we can do more than this. Okay, I know we can. Our goals were modest. When we raised the goals, the only goal that we raised was the commercial construction goal from 4 to 7%. And like I said, we've seen some projects at 20%. So the goals are very modest. In fact, the FTA will be here in the next couple days. We're going to be working with them on the rapid transit project, and I know their goals are higher. So they're going to have higher expectations than our goals, and we'll have to abide by their goals. So we wanted to know why aren't we doing better right now? What's standing in our way? We wanted to explore the barriers that exist for targeted businesses. So we contracted with Mackey Company to explore both internally our policies and procedures, as well as externally what's going on in what we call the entrepreneur ecosystem. with the organizations that help build capacity from startup through training businesses and helping them obtain bonding and learn how to bid, as well as what the prime contractors, what they are experiencing, as well as the DBEs themselves. So we are very fortunate to have Mackey Company here today. Do you have any questions of me at this? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. So good afternoon, Mayor, council members, community, and obviously the media. My name is Lynn Pingle. I am the CEO. Is that better? CEO of Mackey Company, and I am the project team lead for the DBE barrier studies that was connected for the DMC and the city of Rochester. I want to dive a little bit into why this study is so important for us as small businesses, and so are my consultants, because in most cases, cities and government agencies do not look to small businesses to unveil or look behind that iron curtain. And this is really a forward progress, in my opinion, with what the city and DMC is looking at as it relates to really understanding what the barriers are faced by these small businesses. So let me get to the slides. Our scope of work was to identify 4 key components, and that is to identify the barriers of construction. And what exactly does that mean? It's really specific to highway heavy construction and also commercial. What is going on in that ecosystem that is making it challenging for them to become contractors, either with the city or to the primes, our general contractors, right? We looked at startup and growth stage businesses in this ecosystem, and we actually identified 5 key stakeholders outside of the core team, which is made up of Mackey Company, DMC, and the city of Rochester. We identified our stakeholders to be our DBE firms, the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, DMC and the Rochester departments, Rochester's executive team. I've had a couple of conversations with a few of you that are in the room. We identified general contractors, but we also looked at the capacity builders in the ecosystem that are helping small businesses in their development, right? So with these 5 in mind, we proceeded with how we were going to go about meeting this particular scope. So we looked at identifying the barriers of construction. We took a deep dive into the city of Rochester's bidding processes, their insurance and their bonding requirements, to really see, are those barriers, are those really the hindrances, or is there something else? We looked at reviewing best practices, not just in the state of Minnesota, but we went to Ohio and Pennsylvania and California because we saw how they were doing things and how it could also be influential in how we create City of Rochester's processes moving forward. And then last but not least, obviously we're here today so that you can hear the recommendations, right? That's really what this is about. What can we do to move the city forward? Just like the city's motto, right? Forward together. And that's really what we're looking forward to sharing. So our approach, let me move this forward here, in the DBE barrier studies is we took it 5 easy steps, right? We looked at interviewing our DBEs and the DBEs that are specifically in construction. We had about 36% return on our response rate, right? We looked at using, we used our Procurio, which is our online platform to determine assessment and capability and capacity of our DBEs to really understand, not just in conversation, but how are you running your business? What are you doing in your projects? How are you doing these estimating? Because those are really important in the steps that we're trying to analyze. What are your barriers? We hosted listening sessions, 3 of them. City of Rochester and DMC was in one, capacity builders, and then the DBEs themselves. But outside of that, we also did an interview. We did interviews with some of you. We did one-on-one interviews with the general contractors. And then we also chatted a little bit more with our DBE firms and through that assessment. We looked at talking to general contractors from a contractor to contractor level. One of our team members isn't here, Bernard Furlow with Zuri 3 Construction. He actually had the conversation one-on-one to understand what are the GC's barriers, right? So this study really became not just what the DBE's barriers are in procurement, but what was everybody in the ecosystem challenged with in working with our small businesses. And that's really a great reveal there that my colleagues Mitchell and Jared will discuss. Again, we looked at what's other city and state procurement policies and procedures and contracting. We talked to Office of Civil Rights departments to understand, well, What are your challenges? What's working and what's not working there? We looked to understand what the federal contracting mechanisms are about, because federal seems to have it right with how they earmark specific dollar amounts for small businesses. And how can we bring that to our level at the city and even at municipality? We looked at all the disparity studies. Folks, there are so many disparity studies that's been done since 2014. And I have to be honest and tell you, the needle has not moved that much. And so this is alarming, because now it's 2023. We have infrastructure dollars coming down the pipeline. We have all this money coming into the city of Rochester, and we have got to make sure that we're ready for that. And we need to be inclusive of small businesses, right? And then last but not least, we compared all of the practices of the city of Rochester, and we looked at the practices of other cities, states, and municipalities to see where that was headed. And that's essentially the approach and methodology in what we did. Any questions on that before I hand this over to my colleague to talk about DBE challenges? Awesome. Jared Peterson, please.
Didn't advance this one there.
And you're welcome to pull the microphone back out.
Stay up. All right. Council members, we appreciate all the time. My name is Jared Peterson. I am the CEO of Straightforward, a technology consulting firm, disadvantaged business. I've run into issues over and over and over again supplying technology services through government, and that's been my experience. And so I was brought in to interview your DBEs in the Rochester area to find out what their barriers were. And that's where I focused on. And so one of the challenges as we look at our next slide here, obviously with small businesses, as with any business, the number one issue is always funding. That's the number one always. We find that all the time. What we found interesting, and as we take that offline, we move to the next one. The next highest one there is that these ones are lacking the ability to understand how to bid and respond to proposals. They're lacking that clarity. How do I do this correctly? They know they have to respond. They are able to submit, but they are lacking the skills, the understanding of how to actually do that correctly. Even though we see one of the things that read through, they're very active. They're going to training, they're going to development, they're learning how to do this work at the same time as running their businesses, their small, tiny businesses, and trying to make it in the ecosystem. So when we take the financials, a lot of them lack opportunities to really fund a project. They don't have 90 days capital reserves. They don't know exactly how to sometimes calculate their overhead costs and keep those things in place. We see that common in small businesses. But some areas that they're really looking to expand upon in the next 5 to 10 years, we asked them what their goals were. They want to reduce their costs. They want to increase their profit margins. And one of the things that was interesting is that they want to grow relationships with the folks at the city, the prime contractors they want to do business with, but they find that incredibly difficult. And then if we move on to our next challenges. So as we go through that, that kind of rings through that theme about how they find difficulty building relationships. But if we move on to our next slide, we see that in general, some of them use some applications. They have some payment application processes. Some of them develop safety plans. They have overhead cost breakdowns, requirements in order to run a small business. But we see that top one, they're missing some experience. And there's a whole ecosystem of people who support them and train them in here. But we see that the number one thing is they're missing a lot of pieces in order to actually make functioning businesses. When we look at that biggest barrier, though, in our next slide, it's that process of bidding, the process of submitting, the process of winning. They lack that understanding and that experience. And so that's one thing that was kind of frustrating because there's so much time invested in those areas. And then one other of note is that their bids sometimes come in too high. They lose them for reasons they don't really understand. And a lot of times they feel like they were right on and they got bid shopped, or they felt like there was a good old boy network that kind of kept them from actually hitting that number, or it's been played with. So they're games played. That's what procurement games is like. I like to say. So those are some of those barriers as well. And when we look at the key barriers as we identify them, we see that the DBEs are, again, that theme comes through. They're finding it challenging to develop relationships with the key stakeholders, the buyers in these scenarios, whether it's from the city or from a contractor that they're trying to work with. But then the other thing we found in our conversations is that the buyers are also finding it very difficult to have those quality relationships with DBEs. And so we identified some of those areas that can help us bridge that gap, so to speak. And we identified a few of them there. As we pull those through, I'm going to pull out my notes a little bit more here before I start jumping in those. But we see that one thing they're missing is some industry-specific training. So I maybe do construction cleaning. What's my best path to success? How do I engage the right amount of support that exists in the ecosystem to have my fastest path to success? Kind of missing that industry-specific portion of that. They're having trouble navigating that system. They need procurement training. One thing that's missing in general in the industry is a centralized bidding process. We see that they exist. There's lots of platforms that exist, but none exist really from a perspective of a small business trying to manage growing relationships with multiple contractors, multiple city officials, those kinds of things. Nothing's really built from a disadvantaged business perspective, making it easy for them to find their path, find the right relationship to work with. Another one is the high bar for procurement requirements. Union affiliation, those types of things come in as barriers as well to them. And then a lot of times there's a reluctance by buyers and those who are in charge of these projects to debundle their projects into smaller scopes that are easier for that small business to take advantage of. So any questions so far on disadvantaged businesses from their voice and from their perspective?
Councilmember Keen?
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm following your words right. When the numbers I saw about like that we had 70% of the targeted businesses taking that much business, that is figured. That's just, I don't think this is for you, Ms. Peterson. I think it's for someone else, but I think that's calculated after the fact. It's not part of the bidding process, correct?
I'm confused as to which number we're looking
I
at.
think, Ms. Johnson, I'm trying to make sure I understood the numbers. I saw that we had moved a target to 7% and we made 7.8%. That's an after the fact. You're looking at payroll. Where is it coming from?
Is this one? No, the targeted business bidders lists are due within 5 days of the bid, so we can recommend them for award if they meet our goals. If they don't meet the goal, then they have to file for good faith efforts, which proves that they tried to solicit bids from targeted businesses, and that's the only way that if that's approved, that they can still win the bid without meeting the goal.
Okay, then I think I'm understanding the numbers I've seen. I was trying to, because I was thinking when you're talking about small business, these are subcontractors within some of the bigger bidders, and I wanted to make sure I was understanding that. So
yeah, a lot of times they're the tier 2 is kind of what it's called in the industry. Sometimes in some of the government agencies we've talked with, they'll take on some of those directly. And so they'll say, of our spending, we're doing 7% or whatever of our own, or in general, our total spending, we're going to do that, some of that directly, and set their own targeted goals. But in general, we're in the tier 2 as well.
And there's one comment. Listen, I got a little uncomfortable when you talk about they don't have these relationships with city officials. Should they? I mean, I have a bad feeling the way this should be done through professional bidding processes, right? Or are you suggesting we do it differently?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Come on up to the microphone.
yes, it should be done, bidding properly and so, but the preparation prior to the bidding, where you do community engagement, where you do meet and greets to tell the community about the project, that's what's lacking. So there's a disconnect between how project managers are engaging with our DBEs, and the DBEs are struggling to meet who the project managers are when these projects come up. And this happens not just in public sector, it also happens in the private sector. Right. And so this is the reveal of the study, and it happens almost all the time. How do we get to the person that actually makes the decision and not the person who is simply monitoring procurement?
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, who's reviewing the bids? The project manager.
And sometimes council members are that go-between to just introduce to staff
Okay, all right.
Exactly. It's a
That's
transit, yeah,
helpful.
there's a,
That's
there's a
helpful.
bridge. Thank you.
Does that make sense? Okay. Councilmember Wall.
On the previous two slides in your graphs, you have like 1, 2, 3, 4. Are those raw numbers?
Yeah, they're of the sample of the people of the businesses that we interviewed. So, if there's 4 of them had a problem with that particular item.
Okay, so on the previous slide, 2 evidently bid too high, and that's out of how many that you interviewed?
Yeah, we interviewed, we've interviewed 4 as part of we use a proprietary interview process through Procurio. In order to do those interviews, we did 4. We were targeted 5. What we had is we had 4 respond for the study. There were how many in total? How many DBEs total do we have in the
22.
22?
There's 22 in the construction realm, and 4, 5 were invited to do one-on-one interviews, and the rest were in listening sessions.
You have a follow-up?
No.
Councilmember Dennis.
All right, thank you. It's nice to have outside world, because usually I have a little bit of difficulties these days talking to staff due to other barriers. But I wanted to, I look at your study here, the challenges that you have talked to businesses. These are daunting barriers. These, go back systematic. There's, it's ingrained in our culture, unfortunately, what a leader, what looks like. I've talked, experiencing, of course, myself as a female, discrimination. I talk the same way necessarily as maybe your male counterparts, or maybe different disabilities, or ethnic culture differences. There's so many of these that when you talk about lack of experience and all of these huge barriers, it goes way back, and so to make up for all of that, you have to almost go back generational to contradict some of these discrimination that has incredible discrimination that has occurred. How do you? This is. I hear what you're having studies and connecting to people, and I feel I'm going to, my mind's jumping around, so I apologize. There's just so much to cover to equal the playing field. It's a daunting thing. I see, for one of the first experiences I had as a council member, we were looked at the Dooley's property, selling that city property. And I voted against that. I was very vocal in the discussion process that we didn't have other bids. We had one very powerful, well-known person giving a bid that I thought, and others did later as well, was too low. But the discussion wrapped around, well, this person, we trust this guy, he's done good work in our community, we don't need to get new bids, and it was just, didn't want to put the extra effort into getting more bids to sell a property that could have really been influential to a small business or someone who would be part of your DBE, the small minorities, women. So how do you change that? Like, if council themselves and city staff just don't want to get other bids because it's too much work, and they have someone in their, good old boys network that they said, well,
Point of order, Council President.
It's not point
We
of
would-
order.
we would-
I'm
we
asking
would
you
like
a
to not
specific question about these are barriers.
Finley Krug has the floor.
We would like to not misinform the public in a situation that is
I'm using
nothing about what this presentation is about today. And presumably the presenter doesn't know anything about that circumstance. That was a
I'm giving you an
completely different
example.
situation that didn't involve the bidding process that is being discussed here. If
It's
City
an example
Administrator
on,
Zelms has anything to add to that, I'd welcome it. Otherwise, I'd suggest we move on to a question that's relevant to this presentation.
Administrator Zelms.
Thank you, Council President. I just would note that I did hear some language that covered things that happened during a confidential executive session regarding the sale of property. So I just want to remind people to be cautious. But that was a unique circumstance. And I think the sale of property has generally been a unique circumstance in public entities, especially with that particular property. So with that, I think the general question is probably something that the consultant can answer.
I was referring to, you're talking about the centralized bidding process, and that was one example. There's many, many other examples where people have connections with the city that go way back. We can forget about the Dooley's situation, but that we just say, oh, we're going to just give this bid to companies that we or individuals or that we have a relationship with. So
In
My-
order, that is not the process
That
that
is-
we follow in the city. We have a very clearly outlined procurement process that is established within your city charter and references state statute. So I just want to make sure that there's not misrepresentation saying that there has been bidding outside of the scope of what our procurement policies are. I think the question that I'm hearing germane to this conversation is, what are the things within those existing bidding policies and procurement policies that we could change that would reduce the likelihood that we would be preventing people or accidentally missing people in the process who might otherwise be bidding and have access to those projects?
Well, thank you for explaining things. I'm sometimes I apologize for my my neurodivergence and for not speaking concrete sequentially like my male counterparts. But I do feel very that this is an ingrained situation in many fields, many organizations, that there is a connection. I think what the challenges you said were brought up by businesses, the games, the good old boy network, those are real, and getting knowledge and information to minority businesses, to level the playing field, to connect them to people, is incredibly important. I just don't know, like concrete things that can really start chipping away at these barriers. I see, you're telling examples, and maybe I'm just not connecting things, but when you have a situation, a network set up, a system set up that has benefited the white man in our society, how do we really make a difference for the future, and so that we don't just have one bid that comes up, and that more bids is like required, that all property we sell, all things that we do have a very looking out and making sure people are know about this, their voices are lifted up, and that the connections of big money and things are lessened so that they have a real
That's
shot.
what's so hopeful about this presentation is it's not just sitting with the barriers
Absolutely.
that we've learned about, it's
Absolutely.
moving into recommendations.
Absolutely. And so in the recommendations, we'll actually address a little bit of that. And we just want to sort of set the stage. So I truly, truly appreciate you calling out that there is an existing. It's been there for a while, and it's one of those conversations we don't want to talk about because we do have a process, but we are going to address that in our recommendations. If you just bear with us for a little bit, we're going to share how the city can also improve in their own functionalities alongside the current processes that we already have in place. So we're not going to destroy the system and try to build back, because that does not make any sense. So we want to make some suggestions on the action plan, right? The action plan of how can we make a difference? How can we make a change? Because this is not just going to be a study about here's the binder, have fun with it, we'll check on you for 6 months. That's definitely not the level playing field. And I'll give you a little bit of my background later when I come back on stage for the recommendations, so that everybody kind of understands where we are. Okay.
Thank you.
Sherry?
Thank you for that.
And I wanted to, there was something councilperson Dennis mentioned in there about the lack of experience. And that note there was coming from the DBE themselves. They felt that they had a lack of experience, but hearing them talk, they had the experience. They know how to do their work. They felt like I had no experience, and sometimes that was a language barrier or the like. But they had the experience to do the remodeling, the sheetrock, the cleaning, whatever the scenario was. They had the experience, but they felt that was an excuse from the contractor. So just to give you a little bit of clarity on that one. So any others that you had?
Thank you so much for this
All right.
portion.
Yeah, we dug in a little bit deeper, and Mitch is going to talk a little bit more about the processes the city has, and I'll let him. I won't toot his horn.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council President Carlson, and also council members. My name is Mitchell Davis, President of M. Davis Consulting. My work entails strategic thinking, action planning, and healthcare workforce development, and also construction. This has been a really interesting conversation that you've already heard much, and looking forward to presenting the recommendations to you that we have found and also looking forward to sharing with you. Now, Jared, you covered the DBE, and I'm going to cover just the top level of the DMC in Rochester. I'm going to cover general. I'll just speak loud enough so I'm covered. Also, I'm going to cover a bit about the general contractors and then also the capacity builders. So on your screen, you can see that we covered these 6 areas: platforms, industry training. This DMC, the city of Rochester barriers, we had a full room. We had 4 tables. We had over 30 people that came and sat down, and we had several at the doors looking in. So this was a spirited discussion. Under the industry training, the DBE firms talked about their need of understanding the scope of projects, how to bid, and sometimes even how to manage their projects. You can imagine that the DBE firms are small, and so they're doing so much of not only keeping their business running, but they're also trying to solicit opportunities. They're also seeking to work with the general contractors who understand the process much more than sometimes the DBEs. We also talked about centralized procurement. And the departments that were in the room talked about, yes, that is our big goal. Some of the departments said we are attempting to do that. Some said that we have been doing it for years. And others said we are looking to do it, but we all need to come together and do a better job and create a more seamless process. The data capture, that's going to be covered in our recommendations. Bonding and insurance, you can understand that the small DBEs certainly said, we don't want to take on all this risk. But this is the requirement that the state requires, and so we understand that the city must do the same, but it really puts us at a disadvantage. And then the contract language, which was covered already. Lynn mentioned Philadelphia was a Pennsylvania, Texas, and California, and so forth. But even though these efforts are being made, city departments continue to have challenges on how to be more inclusive. So that was sort of a theme that sort of ran just like a golden thread that ran through the conversation. And is that for me? Oh, okay. DMC, the city of Rochester barriers, you can see those there. So I won't read them, but I'll say at the end, even though efforts are being made, I want to underscore again, they said, how can we be more inclusive in not only the present, but in the future that's coming because of the resources that are coming to the city of Rochester? Capacity builders. Now this group, it was hard for us to even keep them contained because some were sitting in their chairs, but when they got up to speak, they stood up and they were animated saying, we must have more control over what's occurring in Rochester. And why is it that you only restrict this to construction? Some of us have professional services that we do. We want to bring that into the process. And they brought quite a bit more. General contractor barriers. And I'm just going to, you can see it there, but I'm going to just read a few comments that showed up in our larger report. And I'm sure that you have received it as well. But under the general contractor section, we discussed barriers as subcontractors, as successes in the challenges of the prime contractors that they're experiencing also. And then they also talked about the DBE process of pre-qualification. And that was another big item that really stood out. And so, for example, when asked if this was the general contractors now, when asked if they have ever offered, solicited, or prepared or scheduled local outreach, underscore that, outreach for DBEs, no one had this on their list of opportunity. So if the opportunity does not exist for the outreach to occur, how can we bring in DBEs? So that was one. And then the capacity builder brought that same concept from their view up again as well. But in general, all the general contractors was concerned about the shortages of available DBEs in Rochester. Lynn, you ready? All right.
Bring this home.
You want this one?
Yeah,
Okay.
take this one. Okay, so this is looking at the whole study. Look, I can talk loud. I teach for a living, so I can vocalize. So barriers compared, we looked at all of the stakeholders, right? So we looked at the DBE firms, the general contractors, City of Rochester, and capacity builders. And what we found really, really cool and awesome, because we're geeky that way, is we have all of the DBE firms making statements such as industry training is lacking. They don't have the back of the office. Like Jared said, they can do the work, they just can't do the back of the house. The bidding, the estimating, the certified payrolls, the pay applications, right? They don't have that capacity and capability, and there's no one in the ecosystem doing that industry specific training, right? We have procurement training pathways. What is the A to Z for a construction cleaner to be successful? What is the A to Z for a painter to be successful, or an asphalt pourer or a concrete pourer? There's no A to Z clear path in this particular industry. Bonding challenges we already talked about, that centralized portal that unifies all the private and the public sector opportunities into one. That's another concern. Union affiliations, that's a given, because most of the general contractors, the Mortensons, the J.E. Dunns, they're all union signers. The City of Rochester, I do not believe, require a union. So you have that disconnect to a certain degree. Okay. And then the debundling and the breakdown of scope, right? So you have $1 million, or let's go $1 million project. How can we cut that into $100,000 projects? Because my capacity as a small business is capped at 100 grand. My bonding capacity, more importantly, is capped at 100 grand, right? And this is why sometimes for a general contractor, it's just easier to go to my go-to, because he's done, I know his work, I know he's been there, right? So before I go into the next slide and talk about the recommendations, allow me to give you a little bit of background on myself. I was a general contractor in Europe and Asia. I ran a construction company that handled commercial and the E40 highway from Kazakhstan to Calais, France. I was a laborer before. I did framing and carpentry, and I did concrete and asphalt. So I used to always say, and I teach this, I didn't usually have nails and used to have nice shoes. I used to have steel toe boots and a construction hat. So I speak from experience when I hear small businesses express their concern that they can't seem to get anywhere in procurement, in bidding, with general contractors like myself. I've fought with government agencies. I've fought with subcontractors as a general contractor. I've been a subcontractor. And I've been screwed, literally, by GCs and by government agencies, pardon my language. But this is the passion in terms of what's going on in this ecosystem that really leads to understanding where we are in procurement. When I came back to the United States, I learned about procurement. I learned the games that are played in procurement from federal, state, county, and city. So I understand how the system works. I've infiltrated it with my work with the Department of Transportation at MnDOT. When I started their Small Business Resource Center, we assisted 127 businesses get $42 million in contracts. It can be done. So how can we do this at the City of Rochester? So it hasn't been all for naught. The City of Rochester has been moving forward, and it's been moving forward together, right? So goals have been met, as Jory and Chow alluded to earlier, with regards to what's going on. And the 2021 Global Mayors Challenge Equity in the Built Environment. Awesome, right? 1 in 15 worldwide. It's designed to create pathways with the money that the $1 million grant, the employment through an onboarding process, equally important in the workforce, right? Opportunities in apprenticeship and the partnerships that's coming into play within that ecosystem, bar none. Amazing, just amazing, right? And then of course the DEI efforts, right? 2 years ago, you hired Director Chow into the ecosystem. And now we've got our departments, our individual departments are now creating diversity, equity, inclusion plans to figure out how can they be more inclusive in their work, whether it's workforce or contracting, right? So that's kind of where we come into recommendations. And we're going to live in here for a little while. And I'm making the assumption that you guys have at least seen the executive summary instead of the 65-page report. So We talk about the DEI plan, right? That's coming into all the department heads. What is that, or what could that potentially entail? I learned from a very, very wise woman in politics to stop asking for more. And stop telling these people they need to do more. You need to tell them how to do it. How can we do it? Because nobody wants to talk about the how. So the how, the DEI plan that's being put in place by Director Chow talks about data gathering. We can plug that in. What is data gathering? If we know what each department is doing in terms of procurement, we can track what work is being done, what is in the ecosystem, and how can we carve that out, debundle those projects, right? And if we're tracking data, guess what? We can build programs. We can build infrastructure in place. We can write contracting language, right? We can determine what our risk is and if it's worth reducing bonding capacity and reducing insurance. But until we have data gathering and we're parsing that data, it'll be a tough sell to anybody in this room if we're going to try to play for something bigger and increase our goal. Like Jory said earlier, we did almost $3 million on a $56 million project. Yikes. Yikes, right? DFC's been here for 10 years. It's a 30-year project. Y'all, we got 20 years left to make a difference. Data parsing and gathering will do that. Equity procurement team. We thought this was one solution that the city of Rochester could embrace. What does that mean? Creating a small business unit dedicated for small businesses, not just those in construction, but also all the other industries that exist in Rochester. Right? If we had a centralized platform, which is that small business portal, attached to this equity procurement team, where we provide a call center response for all small business inquiries, where we share opportunities, where we share the capacity builders that are building businesses and providing industry training, that's what the small business unit can do. And within that is your construction industry training. That construction industry training that teaches them project and construction management, job costing, safety plans, bidding and reading plans. 5 key components to succeed as a subcontractor. It's also for a general contractor that's emerging or a real estate developer. Can an architect do the same? Yes, because they also need to have those classes. And we're not talking about the big firms. We're talking about the small emerging firms that are making less than $1.3 million a year. And that's what's in existence in the ecosystem of Rochester. One of the biggest concerns that the departments had is there's not enough firms bidding. We haven't even explored the crossover of residential contractors into commercial or highway heavy. I did both. I know that if I can pour a driveway and a sidewalk, I can do sidewalks for ADA. And I can also work in clearing and grubbing and do some asphalt work. We're not connecting those two pieces to increase our pool of firms in the city of Rochester. Are they there? Yes. The Department of Labor statistics show we've got licenses that are expired and about to renew. We have to tap into that. And that was one of the suggestions that Jared was like, are we going to talk about that? I said, I'll make mention of that.
Can I interrupt you just very quickly?
Absolutely.
So for numbers 2 and 3, my initial thinking is those would be great sort of across the community, like a workforce development center based or chamber based small business portal compared to a city owned. Is that
Small request this year.
Yes.
yeah, just wondering where that, I can't remember the language in the document, whether that was city led or
So
community-led.
it's city led, and the reason why it's city led is because the city controls the projects that these private contractors work through. Everybody, even private investment group, has to come to the city. So the city can essentially say, go to our portal and find the small businesses that can work on your project. That's the idea, where we can, because again, the city's the one that's got the dollars and cents. The private companies are coming to you to go build their private equity building, right? So at the end of the day, the city either owns the land or has to give permits, has to do whatever. You control it, and you control it. You can put conditions on why they're going to come to Rochester and build. And simply say in contract language, if you're going to build in Rochester, you must use the DBEs recommended in our portal. And guess what? That's what our capacity builders, right? Even our department heads were saying, why can't there be just one outside of the state that's dedicated to buying Rochester first? How cool would it be for all the small businesses in Rochester to have an emblem in their profile that says we're Rochester? And how easy would it be for Mortensen to come in, use that portal, and identify all of the small businesses that are Rochester based? That doesn't exist in any ecosystem, the procurement in the United States. That's focused primarily on the small business. Because again, it's designed for the government compliance component, right? Okay. I hope that answers that question. All right. Can you tell I'm like passionate about this? Yeah, I thought this through a little bit because I've been in this procurement realm for quite some time. Simple steps like modifying the city website. I say that's simple, but there's probably a process, Mayor. We could just simply add our own tab for procurement that connects all the opportunities for the department, right? That doesn't exist right now. That'd be kind of cool to have that. I know that you guys have an outside portal that references where you post all the bids, but again, that's all of the bids, but not easy for a small business to find. So if we could have a centralized tab that talks about that process of small business development, where they reach out and figure out what do I need to run a business, what do I need to subcontract, where are the opportunities for my particular trade, for my particular specialty, and who's there to help me so I can win? And how do I reach that project manager who owns the upcoming cryogenic project that you're going through, right? So that right there, we can carve that out. There's so many opportunities. I was like so excited going, ooh, there's so many different DBEs that I could plug into here, right? And where are the goals set up for that, right? And that's the type of thing. Intentional contracting pathways. What does that look like? So in our review of best practices, we called out in the lengthy 63-page report, we called out MnDOT's, we called out the city of Minneapolis, we called out Hennepin County, who have taken advantage of the carve-outs, right? That's particular contracting mechanism that they call sheltered market programs. And that's for projects under 175,000. MnDOT, I believe, is a 2.25 or 250 with no bond, no insurance requirements. That's pretty cool. So this is a conversation I had with Mike, not to call him out. It's an evaluation of risk for the city. That's really what it is. Can the city afford to lose a $250,000 project over a $56 million project? Is that like less than 0.01%? So we need to look at that comparison to see what contracting mechanism we can put. So creating the sheltered market program can set that up. Modifying contract language, I alluded to it earlier. If we have a centralized portal, we can specifically write in our bid documents, in our request for proposals, IFPs, and so on, that specifically says, use our small business portal to find Rochester-based businesses first. And then we need to continue that, right? We need to continue that when we grade our proposals, that they get a little bit of love, maybe 5% if you use Buy Rochester First program. Now that's real motivator for the big guys like the Mortensons and the J.E. Dunns to go, I got to find all the Buy Rochester program participants and set this up, right? Again, the conversation with bonding and insurance that was prevalent both in the private sector and the public sector can come into that language modification. We need to look at the master contract program so that it's a little bit more inclusive for small businesses to use, right? And then last but not least, the HUD Section 3 program. We got to leverage that as well, right? Because that's something huge. And to kind of tie to Councilwoman Dennis's point earlier, how do we change the mindset? How do we change the mindset of what's going on with project managers who are using the same people, general contractors, and so on? We got to do training. The one thing that the city of Rochester has to put in place, and the department heads call this out, help us identify how marketability and viability of these small businesses are. How do we understand their capacity? Teach us how to go through the procurement training of acquiring and using small businesses and what pathways can be created. So it's all in training, Councilwoman. It's reframing their minds to go, okay, it's now 2023. We've got 20 years left on the DMC. We've got an infrastructure bill that's coming down in $6 billion, right? How can we write contracts specifically for that to include firms and not let it be a shrug off the shoulder, a roll of the eyes saying, it ain't broke, why are we going to fix it? Right? But it is broken, and we know that it's been broken. And that's why if we put together a program to help all of the buyers of the city and the procurement folks involved in contracting, both at DMC and the city of Rochester, we might have a great shot at changing the mindset for the next generation and continue the wealth building and opportunities for the city of Rochester. So with that said, thank you for listening to the passion of all of our voices here. And I'm open to questions. Chow and Jory, if you guys want to join me up here. Here we go.
That would be wonderful. Great presentation. Love your energy. Mayor Norton, start us off.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your presentation, and to the points that were made earlier, the reason you're here and the reason we've been doing all the work that you showed that we have already done is because we're down this path and we're just trying to figure out how to do it and how to do it right. We've not ignored it. We've not cared. We have cared and we haven't ignored it, and we're trying to do something. We just need to get it done and do it right. So I thank you for your suggestions, and it'll be interesting to see where we move forward.
Thank you, Mayor.
Councilmember Dennis.
I am very inspired. Thank you for your work. It's needed more than, I mean, a lot of things are needed, but it's incredibly important. I know, I liked how you said, how you do it? How do you, have training? I mentioned this when we had the UDC having maybe a tutorial online, for people who aren't readers. I'm a visual learner myself. I'm a school teacher, so you have to do a lot of different learning styles for sure for people. So yeah, I just feel like the connections and that I think is the largest barrier is, how do you make connections that have been ingrained? So thank you for helping to try to chip away. And I'm hoping this training can really be ingrained in the hearts and minds of everyone in the city. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I will just quickly add, we had our fire department here last week talking through some new sort of workforce planning models to connect more deeply with those who have been historically not represented in our fire department, and how we think about sort of career pathways. And I love that we keep running into these different presentations where we're really thinking about how do we build processes and pathways that connect more authentically with people who just have not had access, whether or not it's been an old boys club or whatever the issues. We have historically done things in certain ways, and this is an opportunity to improve and really grow the expertise within our city and across our community, in our general contractors, in our disadvantaged businesses. So I just think this holistic approach makes so much sense. And I know it's potentially an investment of resources, and appreciate that we'll have to have those conversations about what it means from a budget perspective, but from a policy perspective, this is so spot on. How do we start prioritizing as a council, or not start, but continue and emphasize priority around these sort of targets and goals and how we're collecting data, so that we can have staff put together the requests and dollars to implement it and make it happen. So it's really exciting.
I do want to close with, it's so clear in all of the conversations with the 5 stakeholders that everybody's united in that inclusion. It is so clear. And so now is really the pivotal moment where we go, okay, now that we have a buy-in, let's create the pathways and let's create the tracks to move everything forward. So again, thank you very much for this opportunity to share this study. And obviously you guys have our contact information. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to the team. And I want to thank our staff too. It's always, how do I say this? It might be a humbling experience to say that we've been doing things a certain way a long time, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And I just want to thank you for your openness to really deeply look at what we're doing and figure out how we do it better. And I really value that and know that that takes a lot of courage. So thank you. All right, moving on to our next item.